What you said was unequivocally, Jerry was one of the most musical people I've ever met. So if that's true, would you tell me how you came to learn that?
It's difficult to describe why how you know somebody is musical. It's just that when I would play anything for Jerry, either of my own or sometimes demonstrating stuff from West Side Story when Lenny wasn't around, he grasped it immediately, and he only needed one hearing to take in all the music, and he could ask you questions or ask you to go back over a specific passage after exactly one hearing. And I also know that when I would play him some of my own stuff, he would respond to the rhythms immediately and comment on them, with the kind of insight that somebody else would have to listen to. Somebody else would have to listen to it 3 or 4 times before they'd grasp what Jerry got right away.
Okay, West Side Story. Why was it difficult to get produced?
Oh, West Side Story was not difficult to get produced. It was turned down by Hal Prince and Bobby Griffith first. No, I cut that. It was actually, let me think about this so I get it accurate. Jerry and Lenny wanted to have George Abbott produce West Side Story because Jerry was a great admirer of George Abbott's and had worked with him. Abbott was mostly a director, but he did occasionally produce. But as he famously said, I don't understand any of the Stravinsky stuff. So, having heard some of the music. So then we went to Cheryl Crawford, and we had trouble raising money, or she had trouble raising money at the beginning, but she had, as a cohort, one of her co-producers was Roger Stevens, who was well known in the worlds of finance particularly, and also as a theatrical backer, to be the co-producer. He wasn't what you call a hands-on producer. That is to say, he essentially raised money and oversaw the finances of the production. So it wasn't difficult to get produced. What was difficult was to pin Cheryl and down to a specific date of production. As time went on, we became aware that she was getting more and more hesitant about the producing of it, until one day which was a couple of months before rehearsals were to begin, she called us into her office and announced that she really did not want to go ahead with the production. She felt, as she stated it anyway, she felt that we did not explore the reasons for juvenile delinquency. She wanted something more sociologically explicit, and which, of course, is not the point of the show. It's not a documentary. It's a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. So we had to find another producer quickly. And Arthur put in a phone call. There's a funny incident. We went near Cheryl's office to the Algonquin Hotel so that Arthur could make a phone call to Roger Stevens, who was in Germany at that point, and say, what do we do next? And they wouldn't let us in because Arthur wasn't wearing a tie. So we went next door to a place called the Iroquois. And there, from a phone booth, Arthur called Roger Stevens in Germany. And Roger said, I'm for the show, go ahead, everything, blah, blah, blah. And so we still had a production, but we did not have a producer. And Hal Prince was in Boston trying out a new show called New Girl in Town. And I called him for advice. And he said, well, why don't you send us the script? I said, Hal, you turned it down once. He said, well, time's gone on. Let's see what you've done with it. And so I actually did not have a complete, none of us had a complete version of the script because we were still working on sections of it. But I cobbled together a copy and sent it off to Boston. And 2 days later, or maybe even the next day, Hal called and said, we're wildly excited. It's terrific. We can't wait to produce it. We'll go into rehearsal the minute we get back to town. We have to concentrate on New Girl in Town right now, but as soon as New Girl opens, we will concentrate on all our efforts on West Side Story, and that's exactly what they did.
There were some stops and starts, though, because of all these producerial changes, I think. And one of the things that Jerry said at one point was that he felt like ultimately that did the show good because it forced the creative team to go back and keep sort of working it and making it...
I have no memory of that. I don't remember that at all. You should check with Arthur on that. Maybe his memory is better. But I sure don't remember making any changes except for what we wanted, or what Jerry would ask for something, and we would try to satisfy him, or we would try to satisfy ourselves.
Now, the show effectively dispensed with the idea of a singing chorus and a dancing chorus. It all got rolled into one. And how did that affect you and Lenny?
It didn't affect us at all. We just wrote the characters as, when you say there's no singing and dancing chorus, in a sense that's true, but in a sense not. Each of the Jets had a name, and they had lines, but they were treated as a chorus, as a group, as a singing chorus and a dancing chorus. It's just that they had specific identities. This was something that dated back at least to Agnes DeMille in Oklahoma, when she characterized a couple of the dancers in her choruses. And so what it really meant was that the chorus was the gang and the gang was the chorus. So in a sense, it didn't make any difference at all. We still, when we wanted a chorus of Jets, it was called, all right, the chorus sings. Only it was called the Jets sing. So it didn't really affect us at all, that I can tell.
I guess what I meant was there used to be a group of singers who was a chorus and a group of dancers.
They were usually split, yes. But by that time, singing and dancing, young performers had to both sing and dance a bit. Again, that started, I think, with DeMille and some of her demands. And I worked as a gopher on a show called Allegro, and singers had to dance and dancers had to sing in that show.
So I guess you would say that maybe West Side took that a step.
Yes, West Side characterized the choruses specifically as two gangs. And within the gangs, you had dancers who sang and singers who danced, mostly dancers who sang.
How was it decided that the prologue was going to be danced?
Well, first, we had a number of openings. The very first opening, I think, was a song called Mix. And then we decided that we would set the scene, maybe strike that. I think the very first opening we had was a scene that we contrived where the Jets were sitting around in a clubhouse, goofing off, reading comic books, dancing, joking, bantering, and eventually taking an imaginary trip to the moon, because space travel was very much in everybody's mind those days. And they took an imaginary trip to the moon and then landed under the supervision of their leader, Riff. And it was all very kid-like. And we spent about a month, Lenny and I, writing the whole thing out. And Jerry, at the end of it, said, I think I could do it better in dance. And so that music, which is now the prologue, was all sung, or most of it was anyway. Some of the music that some of the music from the clubhouse song showed up in the dance at the gym, but much of it was the basis. It was, in fact, the basis of all the prologue. And Jerry danced, and he was right. It established, not only did it establish it more inventively, but it was less kid-like. It was a little more gang-like by having the confrontation with the sharks and all that. So that was the first opening we had. And then, as I say, it was dance. And then the Jet song was sort of appended to that, although that was also part of the music of the clubhouse. It was a song called My Greatest Day. And we changed it to the Jet song.
What does it say about the nature of the collaboration among the four of you, that you didn't feel proprietary, obviously, about your song? You said, oh, okay.
Well, Jerry was the 500-pound canary in the room. I mean, it was really his demands, and he was adamant. Now, we didn't fight him on it because it seemed we understood what he meant. I mean, we were disappointed because we'd spent a long time writing this thing, and we liked it. But we recognized the wisdom of what he was saying, that it seemed right, that you had to have some kind of physical evidence of the coming rumble, that the whole idea of the two gangs just playing and then getting more and more menacing with each other, and more and more and more and more, until finally it almost explodes into a rumble right at the start, seemed like the right way to open it, rather than this comic, kid-like opening. So I think if we had disagreed, I don't know what the confrontation. Usually we found a third solution, when you're in a collaboration. You find if there's real contention, you find a third way of doing it that satisfies everybody. But in this case, it was not a fight.
Do you remember how the transition to the gym scene came about?
Oh my goodness. It was an accident. I do know that. The streamers came down at another point, and Jerry said, "Hey, wait a minute. That would make the transition." It was serendipitous, that I know. I can't tell you exactly.
Yeah, it was one of those,
I'd forgotten
the
that.
artist who knows how to take advantage
Yes.
of the accident story.
Yes,
So I was hoping that.
Oh no, well no, and it probably wouldn't have been very dramatic anyway. It was, obviously it was during the tech rehearsal, and he just said, "Hey, let's try that as the transition." It wasn't a big dramatic eureka moment.
I can't get it exactly from anybody, but I think he was sort of headed out of the theater or something and turned around and saw the streamers in the previous set and said, "Wait a minute."
Oh, that's possible.
Yeah. Anyway, what is, looking back on it now, you have a lot of perspective. What's your assessment of West Side Story as a theater piece?
As a theater piece, I think it's wonderful. I'm not very pleased with my own work, but as a piece, it's terrific. For me, it's not about juvenile delinquency or any socio-political thing. That's merely the story. What it's about is about the theater and how you can combine music and dance and lyrics and dialogue into what amounts to, as they say, a seamless whole. And I think West Side Story does that very well. I don't think it opened any doors for any other shows. It was merely a demonstration of the theater arts, a sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, as Lenny would say. I always like seeing it. I always blush at my own work, that's all.
You blush alone, I think. So when you say it's, you don't feel it has an importance in musical theater history in terms of moving the form forward at all?
No, I don't. I can't think of any show that was directly influenced by it, partly because the content dictates form, and the content of West Side Story dictated that particular form. It's a dance-heavy form. There were, the integration of all the elements of musical that started earlier. That was really the Rodgers and Hammerstein revolution. That was, in fact, I think it's the Hammerstein revolution, because I think it really started with Showboat. But an attempt to tell a serious story through song and dialogue, and that they would support and intermingle as opposed to being separate entities, had begun long ago. This is, I think, more of an apotheosis of that. So I see it as part of a development. It's just a supreme example of the development, and it's an outstanding example of the development. But it's in the development of a kind of total theater work, so I view it as part of a stream.
People who aren't in the theater, I think, don't have a clear idea sometimes about what a director of musicals does. They sometimes think it's sort of a traffic cop.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us what Jerry's contribution to West Side Story was?
Well, some directors are traffic cops, and that's not a bad thing. It depends on what kind of piece you have, In straight plays, particularly, you don't want the director interfering and showing off his inventions. The inventions should be in the service of the script. In a musical, also, the director should be in the service of the piece, more than the script and the songs. But because it's presentational, straight plays are not presentational. Musicals are directly out front and pandering to the audience, so to speak. Pandering is an unfair word, but I mean it is direct address to the audience. And that means the director is constantly present. You're aware that people are being directed because it is not so-called naturalistic. Jerry, of course, what a director of a musical does is have some kind of, certain directors anyway, like Hal Prince and Jerry Robbins, they have a mise en scène, a total vision of the whole evening. And they work towards servicing not only the piece, but the total vision of the piece. That's also true, I suppose, of straight plays. But in the case of Jerry, because he was a master of movement, he could use the actors and the scenery and the lights the way he did in a ballet. so that it had an extra poetic dimension. He was less successful at directing actors. And luckily in West Side Story, you don't need actors. You need performers.
So how would you describe his contribution?
Well, his contribution was the fact that the seed of the idea was his, and that that he made the stage. He used movement, not just choreography, but movement to tell the story, and I mean, I don't know what else I could say that he would contribute.
How would you describe him as a collaborator?
He was a very good collaborator, except when you tried to argue a point with him. He was frightened of articulate people, and though he was much more articulate himself than he gave himself credit for, the collaboration would cease as soon as you started to try logic on him. You had to talk instinctively. You had to talk about the theatrical stuff. He loved to talk theory, and he loved to talk the socio-political aspects and all that, but you couldn't use that with him. As a collaborator, he was an idea man. Jerry is the only genius I've ever met, and for my definition of genius being endless invention. He never stopped inventing, even if I used to have game parties. He would come down, he would invent games on the spot that were more interesting than the games that people play. He was extraordinary. But the inventiveness did not necessarily come through the mouth. It sometimes just came through what he did on the stage. And that was what was exciting, because you could pick up on ideas from him and go home and want to write. The problem was, the invention also got in the way of writing, because you would go home and write something, and then you bring it to him and you say, yeah, but supposing it was all backwards, then you'd have to go and do it again. Then you bring it back to him and say, yeah, that's very good, but supposing it's all yellow, then you go back. Different, and that came, I think, because that's what a choreographer does. He experiments with the bodies during rehearsal and said, oh, no, keep your hand up there. All right, no, try lowering it now. He's able to explore every possibility as a choreographer. Well, he did the same thing with our work, with the songs and with the script, trying to get us to explore every avenue. Well, you can't explore every avenue. You have to settle for something. And so, but that's one of the reasons it always took a long time to get a Jerry Robbins show on.
So do you think, therefore, that he did or did not, in this method, bring out the best in his collaborators?
Oh, I think he did. I mean, difficult as he was to work with, and he could be really mean and awful man. I would work with him anytime. It's worth it. The end product is worth it. He does get not only the best out of you, he makes some of his invention rubs off on you. You get more inventive when you work with Jerry Robbins.
John Guare said, until you've been in a room with Jerry, you don't know what a taskmaster is. Was that your experience?
Well, he was just demanding. That's all. You know, he would be very insistent on certain points. No, I mean, there's a time where you just say, "That's it, Jerry. That's the best I can do." And if he's grumpy about it, then he's grumpy about it. And one of the things that was good was that one of the very few people who was able to stand up to Jerry fearlessly was Arthur Lawrence. In fact, the two people I know, and having worked with, who had no fear of Jerry, were Arthur and Julie Stein. If anything, Jerry was afraid of them. So Arthur very much kept... Lenny was easily intimidated by Jerry, and I saw many examples of it. But Arthur was not, and therefore kept the writing team strong. I think it would have taken longer to write West Side Story if Arthur hadn't been the guy who said, "No, Jerry, that's it. That's what we want." Otherwise, because I would have succumbed. Well, I was only 25 years old. But, Lenny, who commanded huge forces, as conductor and world figure, the minute Jerry would start doing that Jerry stuff, I watched Lenny melt like a lemon drop.
That must have been hard.
Oh, it was terrible. It was terrible. There was one point in Washington where Jerry, who was dissatisfied with the orchestration, had complained to Lenny. Lenny kept the orchestration the way Lenny wanted it. It was the song Somewhere, and Lenny had written it in a certain way, and Sid Raymond and Irv Kostal had orchestrated it the way Lenny wanted it orchestrated, and Jerry didn't like it. And Lenny said, well, I do. And when he didn't change it, during dress rehearsal, or tech rehearsal, I guess, so anyway, the orchestra was in the pit. I think it was dress rehearsal. Jerry went down, and in front of the orchestra and Lenny sitting out front, he changed the orchestration. He just started to dictate, said, I don't want that instrument there, take that rhythm out, etc., right to the players in the orchestra. It was completely humiliating. And I expected there to be some kind of big fight, and there wasn't. Lenny left the theater.
And what did he do after that?
He went to the nearest bar. And I looked around, he was gone. I thought, I'll go outside, see if he's outside. He wasn't. I just had an instinct. And he was sitting there in the booth in the bar with a few shots of scotch lined up. He just couldn't, and I knew exactly, I couldn't either, but, I was a kid, so I thought, hey, he's Leonard Bernstein. He should be able to stand up to Jerry Robbins. Nobody could stand, because Jerry was ruthlessly mean in contentious situations. He was a dirty fighter, and he had an instinct for your weakness. He knew exactly how to get to you. The minute he shook your hand, I think a little cash register clicked in the back of his head, and he said, I know, okay, that guy's afraid of rats. That guy's afraid of dogs. If I have trouble with that guy, I'll bring out a rat. Trouble with that guy, I'll bring out a dog. And he just had an instinct for it.
The only way I ever found to deal with it was to make him laugh.
Yes, Jerry had one of the best senses of humor ever, as you can see in his work, too. Also, the thing that must be said, and I'm sure many of the people you've spoken to have said, is that after 6 o'clock, Jerry was the best company in the world. He was only awful during working hours. And he switched off at 6 o'clock. It was like another Jerry came out. You must have experienced it. And you would have spent an evening with him, and he was just great company and giggly and gossipy, and you had no idea he was truly a Jekyll and Hyde, truly. You had no idea. The Hyde was hidden, no pun intended.
Another quote, you said he had style and substance, but he also knew how to turn it into entertainment. He had a way of dealing with the high and the low, and a way of combining them.
Well, Jerry had a very good instinct for the audience, and in musical theater, he always had the audience in mind. I don't know if that was true in what I would call his serious work, meaning the choreography, but he certainly had one foot planted in the audience. So both the high art part of him, the part that really cared about artistic excellence, was always in gate with the part that said, that's too slow, they're not getting that, we need a laugh there, we got to have a button on that number, etc., etc., etc. He may have thought that way choreographically, because I don't know how choreographers think. But I do know that buttons were just as important to him as the artistic intention of the evening. And he knew that musical theater is popular art. And without condescending to the audience, he always had them in mind. That's what I mean by he always had entertainment going on. He always cared about the audience.
Did you find him to be a decisive worker or not?
He was a very decisive worker once he had a deadline. There's the famous moment where the set didn't go off stage far enough for the Dream Ballet in the second act down in Washington. And we had an audience of 1,500 people coming in the next night. And this was the dress rehearsal. And we thought, it's a disaster, because the bedroom set was supposed to disappear, and then all the cloud formations and the ballet would start, and they'd all have their dreams. And there was part of a bedroom sticking out, which rather spoiled the illusion. Jerry said, I thought, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? If I'd been Jerry, I would have panicked. I'd said, postpone the previews. He said, give me a saw. He didn't say it that way, but he got Ruth Mitchell, the stage manager, to get a saw the set in half, and Oliver Smith, was having conniption fit. His beautiful set was being sawn in half. Jerry said, we'll fix it after tomorrow night, Oliver, but for tomorrow night, I want a clear stage for the ballet. So the bedroom split in half and went off, and that's a practical man of the theater. On the other hand, getting Jerry to commit to a date of rehearsal or something like that, He just hated to be put in that position where he would have to make decisions at a given date, which is why he founded his own dance studio downtown on 19th Street, because he could prepare a piece for a year and a half, and there was no deadline. In those cases, he wouldn't make decisions at all. He did what I spoke about earlier, which is he would try things many different ways because he could afford to do them because it was his own time paid for by government money. If you're working, in the commercial theater, you have to make the decisions, and he could certainly do that when he had to. I think that's one of the reasons that he was thrown off of the movie West Side Story, was you can't do that when you're making a movie. You have to make the decisions because it costs money to postpone the decision and try something else. You can't do that. And, somebody told me, somebody nameless connected with the movie, said that after 2 weeks of shooting, they were 3 weeks behind.
But when he was there.
Oh, man. Come on, nobody was better than Jerry.
You can really see by watching the movie when he was there.
Oh, yeah.
So since you told us you were 25, you must have learned a couple of things from him on West Side Story.
Mm-hmm.
What were they?
Oh, well.
First take a drink.
If I had to take away one lesson from West Side, apart from the practicality of, you can be an artist with a capital A, but you got to be practical. It was the necessity to have staging in mind when you write a song. When Lenny and I had finished writing Maria, Lenny had to go off someplace, I think, to conduct, and so I had to play the song for Jerry, and I did. And he said, "So what is Tony doing during this song?" I said, "Well, he's singing about this girl he's just met." Jerry said, "No, what is he doing?" I said, "Well, I guess he's walking to Maria's apartment. I don't know. Maybe the set is changing." Jerry said, "You stage it." What he was telling me is have specific staging in mind when you write something that you can give a director. Don't just hand a director a song. And it was a major lesson. Every song I've written ever since, I have very specific staging in mind that I can tell the director, and then the director can ignore it, and often does. But it gives him a blueprint or a springboard, whatever word you want to use, to start staging the number. But you can't, it's a director has to, if he has to think up something from scratch, it's much more difficult. But if you say, okay, Tony is walking to Maria's apartment and the set is changing, then the director said, I can't change the set that way, but you know what I can do? We can have a lighting change there. But at least he knows that Tony is walking to Maria's apartment. Now, that may be built into the situation in this particular case, but often you write particularly ballads, and they're just ballads. So you better have something like, she's smoking a cigarette. She doesn't look at him in the face. Whatever you want to point out. It doesn't even have to be specific staging, like she sits in the chair there, although I will often do that. Punctuate whatever the set is with, I'd say, I think on this chord, she can turn up stage. Just something for the director to move from. And unless there's specific action in the song, of course, many times you write a song and the action's built into the lyric. But what he was saying is, give a director some help.
It's interesting because it's also a way of getting a collaborator to think somehow choreographically.
Yes.
It's a step in the idea of unity.
Yes, it is. And up until that point, I had never really thought in terms of staging. I just had a general idea, they're sitting around a clubhouse. But after Maria, I was able to articulate some way what's going on in the song.
What do you remember about West Side Story opening night on Broadway?
It's unfortunately what I remember about West Side Story opening night on Broadway has nothing to do with West Side Story. It has to do with my family. So I can't. The major thing is, of course, that the audience sat there for 30 minutes in complete silence, as if they were at a temple of art, because they'd read the out-of-town reviews, and this was supposed to be a work of art, capital W, capital A. They totally ignored the fact that it was a show. It is, any way you look at it, I don't care what you think of it, it's a musical theater piece. It's a show. And not until America woke them up. America, they said, oh, that's a dance number. Oh, look, they're twirling their skirts. Oh, look, they're singing. Oh, they're funny lyrics. Oh. Then they remembered that it was a show. Up until that point, it was a work of art, and it was deadly.
Do you remember anything about the when the curtain came down at the end?
No.
To what do you attribute the show's success?
It's enjoyable. I mean, what makes any popular work of art popular over a period of time? Gives you a good time.
And the fact that it's celebrating its 50th anniversary and it's still produced?
Well, Oklahoma's older and produced much more than West Side Story.
You don't think there's anything specific to West Side Story?
No.
Okay. How are you influenced in your later work by having done it?
Gosh, outside of what I've just said, I mean, just those little lessons. I learned to be less square, I think, musically from working with Lenny. I learned something about economy and subtext from Arthur. I learned about staging from Jerry, and just general lessons, but certainly nothing specific.
What was the creative team's response to the box?
Oh, well, Jerry insisted on having a box around his name. Arthur got, I don't know if I'm allowed to say pissed off on television. Arthur got pissed off and paid Jerry back by putting a line in about it in Gypsy, which, two insiders got and laughed, Lenny being one of them. Lenny, I think, was the opening night of Gypsy, and when the line came, and they put a box around our name, says Herbie to Rose, there was one laugh in the audience, and it was a loud one.
Before we leave West Side Story, is there anything else you'd like to share with us about the experience, or Jerry in particular?
No, I think I've said it all. I think, when I free associate about Jerry, I think about the endless invention. I think about that given lesson. I think about the Jekyll and Hyde-ness. And I think about the thrill of seeing the work. I remember in those days, he softened later, but he wouldn't let anybody in while he was staging. And, it was my first show, and I went to the first day of rehearsals, and he wouldn't let me in. But he wouldn't let Arthur in or Lenny in. It wasn't just me. He didn't really like people seeing him work. So the first time I saw a piece of work, the first time he let us in to show us something, and I think it may have been the opening, I'm not sure. It was, I virtually cried. I think I did cry. It was just so glorious, even in a rehearsal hall, to see what Jerry does. I mean, it is so far above anybody else who's ever worked in movement in musical theater at a consistent level. I got that kind of thrill also from working with Michael Bennett, but Jerry was the first experience, and at that point there was nobody who had that kind of imagination. People like Michael, there weren't very many people like Michael, but much of what Michael did was, I think, directly influenced by Jerry, by the attitude, by how you use movement in the theater to tell a story.
You said at one point, I think, that he was the best stager of musicals in your lifetime, and if you did, and if...
Jerry?
Yeah, if you
Oh, sure.
repeat that.
Oh, yeah, no, Jerry was not only a wonderful choreographer, he was the best stager of numbers. An example being, I remember one of the most thrilling numbers I ever saw in the theater was There Once Was a Man in Pajama Game. And it was sung by two people who couldn't move, and they were in one, and they did nothing but hand and foot gestures. And, I was cheering at the end of it. It was so brilliantly worked out. And I'll bet it didn't take him 5 minutes, because he staged, we kept asking him, please would you stage Krupke? Please would you stage G. Officer Krupke? And he said, I'll get around to it, but he was much more concerned with his so-called serious work. He wanted to get the second act ballet in shape and the rumble and all that, and he worked on all the big pieces. And finally, it was about 2 minutes before opening, he said, all right. And in one afternoon, he staged G. Officer Krupke. Now, that's the kind of staging, the inventiveness of that staging. That's what I mean by the endless flow. It was like a freshet of ideas, and he staged that number in about 3 hours.
You know, I have a vague recollection that after you wrote Krupke, did you go to rehearsal to play it for him? And I mean, was Krupke written because he asked for a comic number?
No, that's another song. No, it's a song called Like Everybody Else. He wanted to have a comic trio for the three sort of misfits in the gang, Arab and Baby John and Anybody's. And we wrote one, and we were about to put it in Washington, tryout. And Arthur gave an eloquent speech saying that it tipped the first act over into musical comedy, which I think it did. Actually, the most inventive moment I had with Jerry was the opening of A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. We were out of town, and he came in to help us because the show was floundering, and he staged Comedy Tonight. Now, he asked me to write that kind of a number. He said, Steve, don't tell any jokes. Let me do the jokes. Just give me a background to do jokes. And he came up in a week with, one of the 2-3 best opening numbers in the history of the theater.
Gypsy, tell me a little bit about the development as it concerned Jerry, because it was developed in a very different way than West Side Story.
Yeah, Gypsy essentially was a writer's project. Arthur and Julie Stein and I wrote it essentially, and then Jerry, who'd been in Hollywood making a movie, came in and heard it, and that was it. He had very little input into the writing, which, Gypsy was written very swiftly and would never have been written that swiftly if Jerry had been in from the beginning. But Jerry was stuck with a deadline of a rehearsal, and he couldn't be the whole show was written in between September and February, so, and I don't remember what month he came back, but we'd written most of it. And so he wasn't able to interfere very much that way. He wanted to have a kind of panoply of vaudeville acts, panoply of vaudeville acts throughout the show, and that went by the wayside. Outside of that, I can't think of anything that pertains to the writing.
At some point, you and Arthur, I think, went to London, and
that was for West Side Story. For West Side Story, it was not trying out. It was out of town in Manchester in 1958, and Arthur and I went over. Yeah.
And I think you played him.
Yes. Well, we were in we'd written Everything's Coming Up Roses, and so I played it for him one night after there'd been a dress, I guess, of West Side Story in Manchester, and there was a piano in the lounge of the hotel, and so I played it for him. And I finished, and Arthur had liked the song very much, and I did too. And Jerry didn't seem all that pleased. He said, "Everything's Coming Up Roses what?" I said, "Jerry, if one other person makes that error, I will change the title. But the fact is, it took me a week to find that title, and I'm not giving it up that easy."
So by that time, you were a little older than 25?
Yes, by this time I was 28, and it made a big difference.
Okay. There wasn't really much dance in Gypsy.
No.
So can you explain what Jerry did?
No, he just, again, apart from what every director does, which is put it on the stage and give it some kind of visual frame and all that. Jerry's major contributions were theatrical touches, some of which are brilliant, like the crossover where the kids grow up. That was not Arthur's and my and Julia's idea. That was Jerry's idea. The business of Louise facing upstage to an invisible audience and then starting her strip downstage, the reverse, that thing. The way she came out into the darkness and stood in front of the mirror and realized that she was a girl, and a pretty girl at that. That is the kind of thing that Jerry contributed uniquely. The rest of it, any director could have contributed, except for these few touches, which nobody else could have contributed. But West Side could have been, Gypsy could have been directed by anybody, the rest of it.
We know Jerry could be difficult, I don't know, demanding, I don't know what you want to call it, but you remember the story about the famous teapot story with Jane, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell me what you remember about that?
Well, haven't you had other people tell you this?
There's one other person, but I'm curious as to what you remember.
All right. We all were very fond of a girl who'd been West Side Story named Carol Dandria, and she was cast as June, the grown-up June, Danny June. And we decided in Philadelphia that she simply couldn't sing well enough, and we had to replace her. And Jerry agreed, but it really broke his heart as much as ours. And he was of course, the one who had to fire her. And she was replaced by a girl named Lane Bradbury. And Jerry, as was consistent with every show he did, or every show, I mean, from West Side certainly, he always picked one boy and one girl to beat up on. All his hostility would go to one person. In the case of West Side Story, it was Mickey Callan, who played Riff. And I don't remember which girl it was. I know who it was in the London company, but I can't remember who it was in there. And in this case, his anger at himself and at the situation, he turned it on to Lane Bradbury and made life as difficult for her as possible. When we got to previews in New York, the scene in the Chinese restaurant required her to be sitting at the table with Rose and Louise and Herbie, and to move a teapot so that, or to move something so that Rose could put down a teapot to clear a space on the table. She forgot to do it, first preview. And Jerry was furious and bawled her out and was very angry and everything. She unfortunately forgot to do it second night, too. Well, shortly after the restaurant scene occurs the audition number for Granziger, the cow number. And the end of the cow number requires her to turn up stage and take two struts out of the back of the train, there's a little toy train there, and use them as batons and twirl them and do a split, which is exactly what she did as a little girl. And Owens and I, that's another thing. Jerry's staging the vaudeville numbers was absolutely brilliant, and again, something no other director could have done. But at any rate, so Lane Bradbury forgot to do the tune. I was standing in the back, and Jerry, I could see him, just his entire body got tense, and he went backstage. I wondered what he was going to do. And when, a few minutes later, when the number came to a finale, to a climax, and Lane turned up stage, there were no struts. And she was stuck in front of an audience of 200, 2,000 people with nothing to do for the finale except to have to pretend it. It was a humiliating, embarrassing moment. It's like an actor forgetting his lines. Jerry had gone backstage and told Ruth Mitchell, the stage manager, to take the struts out. And Ruthie, who was a strong woman but as afraid of Jerry as anybody else, and also she was sort of Jerry's stage manager. Jerry had brought her into Hal Prince's fold. That's how she became a co-producer with it. She owed a great deal to Jerry. So she did what he asked, which is she should not have done. But I can't blame her as much as I blame him. And that kind of cruelty is fairly mind-boggling.
Now, I understand at one point he decided that Little Lamb should come out.
Yes. Well, okay. Jerry didn't like Little Lamb, and partly again because Lane Bradbury had a solo number. Part of it was he just didn't want her. He just wanted her to suffer because she replaced Carol. And
excuse me 1 second. Was that Lane's number? That's Gypsy's number.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forget. Erase it.
But he still didn't want it.
No. Sorry, no.
He didn't
No,
think the number was perfect.
no, and I'll tell you, I was mixing up with another thing too, which is when Sandra's boob fell out, and Jerry blamed her for that, and so he didn't like her either. So, but it wasn't the same thing as Lane. That's a whole other story. No, sorry. Yeah, okay, scratch it. All right, so he didn't want Little Lamb there. Originally, Little Lamb was in the middle of the Goldstone number. There was a chorus or two of Mr. Goldstone, and then the lights switched to Louise alone with her animals, and she sang Little Lamb, and then it went back to Mr. Goldstone, and that didn't work. And I think it was at that point that Jerry said, let's cut Little Lamb. And I can't remember the exact sequence of events because certainly the notion of doing all of Goldstone and then all of Little Lamb occurred, but it may have occurred later. The point was he just took it out and without permission of the authors because we didn't want to do it. And we called the Dramatist Guild, which is the protective society for writers, and threatened an injunction against the show because it's a breach of contract. Drama's contract is very clear on authors' rights being protected. And so he said, all right, then you'll have to stage it. And that's exactly what Arthur did.
So Arthur ended up...
My memory is, yeah, Arthur staged it.
Now, tell me about Rose's turn, because I think that was... You were involved in how that was...
Well, what happened was we were... originally, there were 3 Louises and 3 Junes. And Jerry wanted what he called a kaleidoscopic ballet at the climax of the show, in which Rose would have a complete kind of nightmarish replay of her life, all danced by the 3 Louises, the 3 Junes, Herbie, etc. Not unlike the ballet in the second act of West Side, except it wasn't that kind of a dream of life. It was her life flashing before her eyes. And about 2 weeks before rehearsals, he said he didn't have time to do it. He said, I just don't have time to direct the show and do that. That's a major dance piece. So why don't you guys write a song that she can sing instead? All right. So we were in the middle of rehearsals. And I said, can we talk about it a little bit, about what it should be about? And he said, sure, after the rehearsal tonight. And so we agreed to meet at the end of the rehearsal, but Julie couldn't. Julie had a date. And so it was just me and Jerry. And this was at the top of the New Amsterdam Theater, where there's a rehearsal space. It used to be a theater for Ziegfeld, called for the Ziegfeld Midnight Frolics. So it's a stage and seats. I mean, I doubt if it exists now, but it existed in 1958. And so I met with Jerry there, and it was very dramatic to me because I was brought up on movies and the whole idea of, you know, you write your piano concerto when you're sitting in your penthouse overlooking the lights of New York. Same thing here. Like Mickey and Judy. Here you are in a darkened auditorium with just a work light on stage, and Jerry Robbins. And I said, look, Julie can't make it. He said, well, why don't we try ad-libbing something anyway? And so we started ad-libbing. He said, give me some strip music. So I said, look, the whole idea, it seems to be the number. If you wanted to include all the people in Rose's life, why don't we include all the songs that she has had anything to do with in the show and use them and mash them together and make this number? And he said, great, why don't you? And so I started to ad-lib something. And he started to walk like a stripper, back and forth across stage like Rose, stripping, you know, like Ethel stripping. And we started to ad-lib this number. And I started to put the various themes together. And we must have worked about 2 hours. And by the end of it, I had a whole sketch of the whole piece. And in a great state of excitement, went to Julie the next day and I said, it's solved, it's solved, it's solved. And so we did it. And the rest of that story is we presented it to Ethel. Jerry said, will you play it for Ethel? Because he thought it was swell. We said, sure. Well, we played for Ethel. We were still in rehearsal, and it was Ethel and the whole company. So it wasn't just Ethel. But in those days, I had plenty of confidence about singing in front of people like that for the first time, trying the number out. And we were nervous about what Ethel would think. And I had used a moment in it where she stumbles on the word mama, and she starts to stammer, which is actually a moment I stole from Tennessee Williams from Streetcar Named Desire. When Blanche's mind starts to crack and she starts to stammer. I don't know whether it's written in the play, but when I saw the play, that's what Jessica Tandy did. And so I thought I'd use that stammer. And so we played it. And I got to the stammering moment, but when it was all over, Ethel said, well, it's sort of more of an aria than a song, isn't it? I said, yeah, but it's still a song. It's all the tunes you've been singing all evening long, Ethel. I said, yeah, I know, I get that, but that ma-mama stuff, I mean, is that on the downbeat or is that on the upbeat? And I said, well, you see, no, it's written so you can do it any way you wish. It's really an acting moment. And Milton, that's the conductor, will keep the vamp going. And one night you might want to go mama, and another night you might want to go mama, mama. but it's whatever you want to do. She said, oh. But is it on the upbeat or the downbeat? That's the Rose's Turn story.
How did Jerry work with her?
I wasn't around whenever he was alone with her. I can't tell you. My guess is he just deferred to her. He wanted to do the show because he wanted to work with a star.
Did he ever talk to you about his mother?
No.
Tell me about Gimmick. Whose idea was Gimmick, and what was Jerry's part in turning that into the number it became?
I have no memory of how it arose. The show was written so quickly. I think we just got to the moment, and there were strippers, and Louise had to learn something about the notion of a striptease, and the way she learned it was seeing everybody do something blatantly different except exactly the same, and then she realizes, or certainly the whole idea is you tease, you don't strip, you tease. You don't bump and grind, you promise to bump and grind, and you don't do it. And so that's what the number's about. I think, as I look back on it, I probably thought we need some variety. We've had Ethel sing a lot, and Louise sing a bit, and Ethel sing a lot, and the Hollywood do it. You needed some other voices, some other characters, but I'm not sure. Anyway, it just seemed a logical thing to write. And then when we were auditioning strippers for it, the song had been written, and we were auditioning strippers, and in came Faith Dane with her trumpet, and that was part of her act, and Jerry appropriated it. The others he invented himself. My guess is, my memory is that Arthur named the strippers after Jerry. Well, Tessitura, I think he named, because that had nothing to do with her strip. But Electra and the whole idea of the electric lights, I don't know which came first, the name or the notion. It's conceivable that the name came first, but my guess is that the notion came first, but I really don't remember. But there's nothing particularly special about, in my memory of nothing special in my memory of writing that song except for when Faith Dane came in and auditioned. It was just a
Okay,
song.
so here's a question I've been wanting to ask since I was 10.
No.
So did Mazeppa get the name because it rhymed with Schlepp?
Oh, no. I was Arthur. No. Arthur, it was Arthur. No, because his joke, Mazeppa Revolution and Dance, which is real. Arthur has one of his greatest talents is for names. And those names, Tessitura and Mazeppa and Electra, that's really, really wonderful. No, it was just lucky.
So you came up with Schlepp.
Of course, but it was just lucky.
Okay, so you've talked about Jerry having a sense of vaudeville and showbiz, and do you think that had to do, or what do you think that had to do with his training at Tammament?
Goodness gracious. I don't know. I only was up at Tammament once, and not as a writer, but to visit. And Jerry, it was long past the Jerry era, so I have no idea. I do know that one thing that everybody learned up at Tammament was how to put on a different show every week. So that whole thing of, again, as I said, Jerry's powers of invention, he could have put on 3 shows a week. But most people can't, and that's the great training of Tammament and Green Mansions is that you had to do it every week.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question about your assessment of Gypsy. I want to read you something quickly.
Okay.
This is Tynan. Kenneth Tynan wrote this. He said, this is about Gypsy. It brings together an effortless coalition of all the arts of the American musical stage at their highest point of development. So smooth is the blending of skills, so precise the interlocking in song, speech, and dance. It's like being present at the triumphant solution of some harsh architectural problem. The finished structure seems as light as an exhalation, though in fact it is earthquake-proof. Do you agree? Do you not agree?
He liked the show. What can I say? I like the show, too. He liked the show.
Well, okay, so it's known as the perfect musical. What do you think of it?
Who called it the perfect musical?
Many people have called it.
You'll have to give me whoever called it.
Well, Tynan came close.
No, he didn't say it, though.
Well, he said it's earthquake.
Earthquake, that's not the same thing.
Well, what do you think?
Perfect? No, where's perfection? I could think of shows I think are just as perfect as Gypsy. I can think of shows just as perfect as Gypsy, in my opinion. But
Okay.
I I don't. There's nothing I would want to change in Gypsy.
Well, that's pretty strong.
Yeah.
Assuming your work is informed by everything you did before, what did you learn from Gypsy?
Gosh, I suppose that was the show where I learned more about subtext, because it really was about character. West Side's not about character. Also about something subtle about the difference between plays and musicals. Because I remember saying to Arthur, "Listen, what you're writing is so strong. I don't know why this shouldn't be a play. Why should it be a musical?" He said, "Oh, no. If I were writing it as a play, it would be written with much more subtlety." He said, "I'm writing very, very bold colors and very bold strokes." And he's right, of course. And it was something I didn't realize as we were working on it. But as soon as he pointed it out, and that also sank in with me, the difference between a play and a musical in the writing. And I can't articulate it, but I can recognize it.
Okay, so before we get off Gypsy, anything else you want to say?
No, what else do we have to do? Because it's getting
you talked a little, we're almost done. You talked a little bit about Forum.
Okay. All right, anything else about Gypsy? The trouble is I've told these stories so many times that my mind is blocked off to any other memories I have. But the fact is, when I think of Gypsy, I don't think of Jerry. When I think of Gypsy, I think of Arthur. When I think of West Side, I think of Jerry. And I think that's it. Gypsy is an Arthur show. West Side is a Jerry show. That's not decrying any of the rest of our contributions. But the piston for West Side was Jerry, and the piston for Gypsy was Arthur.
I completely understand that. So before we get off Forum, then, you talked a little bit about it. Tell me how specific he was in telling you what he needed.
Oh, he said the trouble with the opening number, we had an opening number called Love's in the Air. He said the trouble with the opening number is it doesn't prepare the audience for what the show's about. It doesn't say this is going to be low comedy, baggy pants comedy. You got to write a song called Baggy Pants. I said I did. I wrote a song called Forget War, which told the audience exactly what the show was going to be. And George Abbott said, I don't like it, I can't hum the tune. So then I wrote another song, which was Love is in the Air, which is a charmer, and led the audience into thinking they were going to have a charming evening. It did not prepare them for the wildness that followed. And as Oscar Hammerstein taught me, the opening number is where you make or break a show. That is to say, if the opening number is wrong, it takes a very long time to recover. But if the opening number is right, you can coast for a very long time. Well, this was a case where the opening number, which is a perfectly nice opening number, was entirely wrong. And so I said, I wrote one. He said, well, you can't use it because George doesn't like it, so write another one of the same sort. But just don't tell any jokes. Let me do the jokes. And that's what I did. I wrote it virtually overnight. I think we met on Friday, and I handed it to him Sunday.
And how specific was he? All he said was just write.
He said, just tell the audience that it's going to be low comedy, mistaken identity. He kept using the word baggy pants, which means vaudeville comedy.
But he didn't say, tell them it's going to be something like this or something like that.
No.
Okay.
No. I had written, one of my sketches for the opening number was called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. A funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. Some baby got kidnapped on the way to the Forum. Some pirates came in on the way to the Forum. A man mistook his wife for a maid on the way to the Forum. I'd already sketched that kind of thing out. But what he wanted was something very general about baggy pants, which in fact was what Forget War was about.
Now, he had a sort of checkered relationship with Forum, didn't he? He first...
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, yes. It was Bert Chevelov's idea, and it was right after West Side Story, and I wanted to write something with Bert, and he said, well, have you ever read Plautus's plays? And I said, no, and Bert gave me the Loeb Library translations, which were deadly, and I said, he said, no, don't look at the prose style, just look at what they're about. And he said, I think we could mash a few of the plays together and make one. And I mentioned it to Jerry. Jerry said, that sounds great. He obviously wanted to do something entirely different than West Side Story, because we started this before Gypsy. And so he said he'd be interested. So Bert invited Larry Gelbart to join the project, and they wrote the book together. And Jerry said he'd do it. But he kept postponing the date and postponing the date and postponing the date and postponing the date. And eventually he chickened out. And then we got George Abbott. There was a point in there where Josh Logan was going to direct it at one, or we brought it to him after Jerry chickened out, and then we brought it to George.
And how was it going with George before you called Jerry?
It was fine. I was not the fan of George Abbott that many people were. We. It sounds mean to say, but we had to explain jokes to him. Maybe the funniest joke in the show, Strange Little Boys. Bert and Larry had to act it out for him. What he was wonderful at was running the ship. There were some difficult moments during rehearsal when Jerry got in, and Jerry and Zero had a history together. They behaved very well with each other, but Zero took his anger out on me instead of on Jerry, and there was a disruption in rehearsal when we got to New York, and George Abbott I won't tell the story because it involves some filthy language, but George just stopped the contention right there, said, let's take him on top, just cooled the atmosphere. He was a great captain. And he also, I must say, he did say, we were in the back of the theater in New Haven, and the show was a disaster. And the audience wasn't laughing at all. And George Abbott, as you know, was a famous play doctor. People would call him in to help out on both straight plays and musicals all the time because he was such a savvy showman. And we were standing in the back, and I heard George murmur, I don't know what to do. We'll have to call in George Abbott.
So whose idea was it to call in Jerry?
Mine.
And can you say that, and how was it received?
Hal did the actual call. I said to Hal, call Jerry. And Hal did. And Hal would have to tell you how it was received because Jerry knew that it meant being in a room and working with Zero, and maybe he thought I can make up with Zero if I come in and help the show. That could very well be part of the motive. Hal would probably have more insight into that than I because he was the one who, as producer, who actually had to do it.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to say about Forum? I have just a couple more things to ask you.
No.
You were, I think, somewhat of a, forgive the expression, matchmaker in Fiddler.
Oh, my God. How'd you find that out?
Oh, we have our ways. We get the informations from various people.
No, my memory is I heard the score of Fiddler, I think, up at Joe Stein's house in New Rochelle, I think it was. And I called Jerry and I said, there's a show. You've got to. This is, I think, right up your alley. I also called Hal. I can't remember. No, I may be mixing something up here. Anyway, Jerry was the first one I called. So the point is, I heard the score and I just thought, this is so much up Jerry's alley. That's it.
Okay, well, you did a good thing.
Yeah.
You talked a little about this before, but he was articulate, not articulate.
No, he wasn't articulate. Curious enough, no, he wasn't articulate on any subject, really. No.
But Sheldon told me you gave him a very good piece of advice. And you said you have to listen to him very carefully because he doesn't consider himself articulate, but what he is poetic.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
I can't give you examples, but Jerry, in trying to find the right word, would talk around it and give images. Jerry thought in images, as anybody who's primarily visual does. There are very few people, Hal being one of them, who are both visual and verbal. John Guare's another, visual and verbal. Jerry was only visual. I think he might have appreciated language, but he was not articulate that way. He couldn't find the words to express exactly what he expressed. So that it got in the way when he would direct an actor, he wouldn't be able to tell the actor exactly what he wanted. He would have to talk in images. And if the actor was the kind of actor who can translate images into action, great. But not many people in musical theater can do that. A lot of what they call serious actors can, but not many people in musical theater. So I watched him try to direct certain people I don't want to name, and he couldn't get the performances out of them because they didn't know how to respond. He couldn't make himself understood. When he was as a choreographer, all he had to do was get up and take the pose, and the dancer would get, oh, I get it, I know what he wants.
Many years after you worked together, he was given the Kennedy Center honor, and he asked you to present it, and you, I think, declined. Why?
I had forgotten that. I wonder if that's true. If I did, it certainly had nothing to do with personal things. I think it had to do with entirely, I don't like appearing in public. I certainly, if I did decline, it had nothing to do with Jerry qua Jerry. It had to do with getting up there in black tie in front of 2,500 celebrities and not peeing in my pants. I mean, it's just, no, that's just not the kind of thing I want to do. I think if Jerry had been a close friend, if it had been Hal Prince, for example, I would have done it. But it would take a close friend to make me get up there and do that.
Okay. When you think back on Jerry's career, what role do you see him having played in the evolution of the American musical?
Oh, dear, I can't answer questions like that.
Well, do you think of him as a sort of bridge builder between, you talked before about Hammerstein and Showboating, you mentioned Agnes. Do you think of him as something
No, because I think the people who essentially change the theater are writers, not directors. Directors can, I know, for example, that the fluid staging of South Pacific by Josh Logan, which involved wipes and dissolves, came out of Allegro, the show that Oscar had written before South Pacific, in which Oscar, as writer, had described the action as being fluid and had devised with Joe Milziner a serpentine curtain that wiped things away and pushed things back on. Allegro was not a hit, but Josh had seen it, and Josh used it. Then Hal saw Josh's work. So in that sense, there was a development that way of directors in the theater, a kind of fluidity of staging. But it started with the writers. It was the writers who started the fluidity. And so I don't think of directors as shaping the course of the theater. I think of writers doing that.
Fair enough. Okay, I know you're dying to go.
Yeah.
This is really going to stick. This is going to be a thorn in you. So
Well,
I'll leave it totally to you. If you want to stand up and say I'm done, that's okay.
Sure.
What was the exception in the rule?
Oh, I can talk about that.
Okay.
It's not a thorn at all.
No? Okay.
Oh, no. Jerry wanted me to write a show based on a Brecht play called The Measures Taken. I'm not a Brecht fan. I read the play, and I said, I don't know how you do it. It's a play about a trial, as many Brecht plays are. And he said, literally, well, would you turn to the next play in the book? It was a collection of Brecht plays. I thought the next play in the book was called The Exception in the Rule. And I read that, and I thought, well, it could be a musical. And I wrote, I think, 2 songs. And they just didn't feel right. I was trying to get into the Brecht mode, and I couldn't do it. And I said to Jerry, I just can't. I think I even played it for him, and he said, yeah, I see what you mean. They just weren't right. So I suggested I suggested that he get Lenny to do it, because Lenny wrote his own lyrics for things like Trouble in Tahiti. And Lenny, Brecht was right up Lenny's alley. He loved Brecht. And Jerry didn't want that, but anyway, I can't remember. I don't think it was my suggestion. Anyway, it ended up with Lenny writing with Jerry Lieber, and they wrote some songs. And then I got a call from Jerry saying, I wish you'd come up and listen to the songs because I don't think they're right. And I said, okay. And I went up and listened. I thought they were terrific. I thought the lyrics were terrific. I thought the music was exactly what Lenny should write for that kind of thing. It sounded to me fine. I really couldn't understand why Jerry was unhappy. And to this day, I don't know why he was unhappy with it. But so Lenny and Jerry together actually drew me into a room afterwards after I'd heard the songs and said, please, Steve. I said, no, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. Please, Steve, will you write? I said, really, I don't think there's anything wrong. Thanks, Len. Then a few weeks later, the putative producer was Stuart Ostro. And he said, we have John Guare to write the libretto, and he has an idea. Would you come and hear John's idea? And I thought, just to be nice, and John was a friend. because I certainly had no intention of writing just lyrics again. And I thought John's idea was so terrific. I thought, Jerry directing and this terrific idea, oh, well, what the hell, why not? And I really like Lenny and blah, 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 blah. So I said, okay. So Lenny and I wrote, I guess, about 8 songs. And the problem was that Lenny was treating me the way he did when I was 25 years old, as if time hadn't passed. You know, it's like he had to vet every word. I had to defend every word I wrote, and so I was not having a good time. Meanwhile, I could sense Jerry wasn't having such a good time either. And so we had dinner, the 4 of us, one night, John and Jerry and Lenny and I. And I think it was at my request. I said, look, I really can't go on with this project. You're welcome to use whatever I've written. Anything you want is yours. But I'm just not having a good time. I don't think it's turning out right. And I think the idea of it is swell. And shortly thereafter, Jerry also quit, so to speak. He left the project. Lenny wanted to continue it. I don't remember what John's attitude was at the moment, at that time. And then many years passed. The project got revived, or the idea was resuscitated for Lincoln Center. Guare came to me and said, they needed some more. So I said, John, it's just not for me. He said, you mind? I said, no, you do it, by all means, you do it. And do whatever you want with any lyrics I've written. They're all yours. Do with them whatever you want. And write your own, which he did. And then the project never came to fruition.